Today we're going to discuss a little bit about early Scots Masonry and the Scottish Rite. So I know many of us have wondered, why is it called the Scottish Rite? Do we have any real historical connection to Scotland? Is there another reason? And why are there so many so-called Scots or Scottish degrees in Masonry around the world? Well, today we're going to look at a couple of these questions and discover some of the history that connects the Scottish Rite to the beginnings of Freemasonry as a fraternity. And in order to do that, we'll have to look back at the first three degrees and indulge me as I give you a little bit of history. Well, obviously we can't recite hundreds of years of history in the short time that we have together, although I would like to do so. But so we're going to have to redact and omit a bit here. But let's look at some things that we do know. In 1598 and 99, some 15 years after the Scottish king James VI appointed William Shaw the master of work over the Masons, Shaw issued his famous statutes, the Shaw Statutes, which helped form the basis of government for Freemasonry, for Masonic lodges. Among other things, the Shaw Statutes defined a hierarchy of wardens, deacons, and masters in all things concerning the craft. Lodges were said to be presided over by a general warden, while William Shaw himself presided over the Masonic lodges in his own country, as Grand Masters do throughout most of the world today. We can't say when the first Masonic initiations occurred, but by 1630 we hear of the Mason word in Scotland. At the same time that the lodge system was developing in Scotland, the London Masons' Company became active in England. There's evidence that as early as 1630, some Masons within this London Masons' Company underwent an exclusive privilege of being admitted to what they called the exception, although the precise meaning of the term is not understood. However, additional support suggests that this exception represented an initiation into some type of group which embraced both operative Masons and non-craftsmen. But the earliest descriptions of Masonic ritual are from Scotland. The earliest known was transcribed in what we call the Edinburgh Register House manuscript, which is dated to 1696. It includes only 2 degrees, entered apprentice and fellow craft. After the first Grand Lodge was formed in London, there were still only 2 degrees in Masonry. The Master Mason's degree, which was truly the first high degree of their system, wasn't conferred until 1725. These 3 degrees of craft masonry, forever linked thereafter, might be said to have formed the first Masonic Rite. In a broad sense, all other high degrees stand apart from the craft rituals, although some of the high degrees might be dependent upon them. The oldest of them, the Scots, Scotch, or Scottish Master or Masonry, arose in London. As early as 1733, a reference to a Scots Mason's lodge appears in one of the antiquarian manuscripts of Richard Rawlinson. The name Scots and Scottish did not mean that the degree arose in Scotland. It's believed that early Masons who were aware of the important role that Scotland played in the craft in our ritual development called the degree such out of honor. The term later came to be used collectively to mean the best and learned Masonry. Today it's common to refer to these degrees and their descendants as either Scots or Écossais Masonry. A Scots Mason's Lodge was listed in an engraving of 1734 and yet again in an engraved plate of 1735 from which this image was taken. We also see that it was listed as Lodge number 115. Early period Masons held their lodges in very convenient places, such as above a bar or tavern, or even in a wealthy person's home, as long as they had enough room for the lodge to meet. The taverns also had very catchy or exotic names. The first known Scots Masons Lodge met in the Devil Tavern, Temple Bar, or the Tavern in London, and it was short-lived. We believe that it was started in 1733 and was erased by the Grand Lodge only 3 years later in 1736. The fact that it met in the Devil Tavern itself is important because it was the favored meeting place of the Grand Lodge, as Albert Mackey noted in his Masonic Encyclopedia. Mackey stated, "For a long time after the revival of Masonry in 1717, Masonic lodges continued to meet as they had done before that period in taverns. Thus, the Grand Lodge of England was organized, and, to use the language of Anderson, the quarterly communications were revived by 4 lodges whose respective places of meeting were the Crown Ale House, the Apple Tree Tavern, and the Rummer and the Grapes Tavern. For many years, the Grand Lodge held its quarterly meetings sometimes at the Apple Tree, but principally at the Devil Tavern, and kept the grand feast at the hall of one of the livery companies. This is the plate of the list of early English lodges, which included the Scots Masons lodges, number 115. The chart first appeared in Bernard Picard's Religious Ceremonies and Costumes of All the Earth's People. It was published in 1735. We do know that from that period to about 1746, there were at least 4 lodges conferring the Scots Master degree in southern England, but we do not know much about the original Scots Master degree. We do know that it required at least 3 officers and that multiple persons could receive the ceremony at the same time. One of the most interesting things about Scots Masonry is that the degree was owned or controlled by the heads of the lodges before there were such things as separate Masonic rites. If we look at these dates at which high Masonry or the high degrees began to appear, they're notably in rapid succession. In 1717, the traditional date of our founding, we have only 2 degrees in Masonry, as I mentioned, the Apprentice and the Fellowcraft. 8 years later, in 1725, we have the first appearance of the Master Mason's degree, and 8 years later, that of the Scots Master. We don't know who invented either the Master Mason's degree or the Scots Master degree, but we do know that they were both considered regular and that they were conferred in regular lodges. Well, what was going on in these lodges? If we look a little closer at this early list, we see that the Scots Masons Lodge, which met in Devil's Tavern, is not the only peculiar one. There are 3 others, numbers 116, 117, and 120, which were called Masters' Lodges. About 130 years ago, an English Masonic scholar, John Lane, noted something peculiar about these 4 lodges. None of them had ever been warranted or paid for a charter, but they were completely regular. Well, what was going on there? The answer is they seem to have met only for the purpose of conferring degrees above the Fellowcraft. Although we're unsure what occurred in this original ritual, we can likely have some idea by comparing it with later degrees with the same title and look for common elements. In a similar way, we can look for commonalities in various versions of the Master Mason's degree used throughout the world, and we're pretty safe in saying that the common elements are most likely the oldest. Of course, there will always be room for improvement and refinements in these rituals and added lectures, but as we shall see a bit later, the old commonalities may reveal something interesting. From about this period, we see the emergence of the high degrees. On October 28, 1735, at the lodge at the Bear in Bath, a lodge of masters met extraordinary, and several brothers were made and admitted Scots Master Masons. In 1738, we have the testimony of worshipful brother Hugo O'Kelly, who testified before the Portuguese Inquisition that he became a Mason in Ireland in 1734-35. He said that there were more classes of Masons, which were called excellent Masons, and Grand Masons, which are above all others. In Minute Book C of the Old Lodge Number 1 in London, which met at the Goose and Gridiron in 1717, we read that on June 17, 1740, 9 members of this lodge were made Scots Master Masons by Brother Humphrey, whose lodge met at the Morning Bush Tavern in the Aldersgate Ward. Also in 1740, we find a clear reference to the Scots Master Mason's degree conferred on normal Master Masons, as we read that at the lodge at the Rummer in Bristol on July 18, 1740, it was, quote, ordered and agreed that Brother Thompson and Brother Watts and any other members of this lodge that are already Master Masons may be made Scots Master. This is evidence that this was truly a higher degree. Within a couple of years, we see the Scottish degrees appearing in France and Germany, and several hints in early German records point to their likely English origin. The worshipful and most respectable Scottish Union Lodge was founded in Berlin on November 30th, 1742, by 7 Frenchmen, and worked in French before the rituals were translated to German. The French titles of the officers were translations of those found in England, rather than the traditional Masonic titles used in France. Similarly, the regulations emphasized that the customs of the Scottish Union Lodge would conform to those of the English lodges. A couple of years later, in 1744-45, the book Le Parfait Maçon was published in France, which has particular relevance to the development of high-degree Freemasonry. In a section on the so-called secrets of Scottish Masons, the author wrote, "It is said among the Masons that there are still several degrees above that of the Masters, of which I have just spoken. Some say there are 6, and others that they go up to 7. Those called the Scottish Masons claim that they form the 4th degree. As this Masonry, different from the others in many ways, is beginning to become known in France, the public will not be annoyed if I relate what I have read about it, which seems to give the Ecclesiastes a degree of superiority above the apprentices, fellows, and ordinary masters. Instead of weeping over the ruins of the Temple of Solomon, as their brethren do, the Scottish Masons are concerned with rebuilding it. Everyone knows that after 70 years of captivity in Babylon, the great Cyrus permitted the Israelites to rebuild the temple and city of Jerusalem, that Zerubbabel of the house of David was appointed by him the chief and leader of that people to return to the holy city, that the first stone of the temple was laid during the reign of Cyrus, and that it was not completed till after the 6th year of the reign of Darius. It is from this great event that the Scottish Masons derive the epoch of their institution, and although they are later than the other Masons by several centuries, they consider themselves of a superior grade." So here we have the main features of this early Scottish Masonry. It wasn't concerned with the building of Solomon's temple, as were the early craft degrees, but rather with the rebuilding of the temple. Masonic encyclopedist Henry Coyle noted that the underlying theme of these degrees related to the removal of rubbish from the first temple to lay the foundations for the second, and the discovery of a vault or crypt. From other early forms of the ritual, which appear about this time, we see that it enlarged upon this symbolism. Perhaps naturally, these higher Scottish degrees sought to recover the secrets that were lost in the symbolic degrees, they being mostly rediscovered upon a metal or a triangular plate. This recurring theme is found in many degrees around the world. It should be said that there were several so-called Scottish degrees by this point, some of which break up the story into several parts, so that such degrees as the Knight of the East or Prince of Jerusalem developed as 2 parts of a single story. The Scottish writer and educator Andrew Michael Ramsay, better known as Chevalier Ramsay, lived most of his adult life in France and was associated with Masonry from its beginning there about the year 1725. In 1737, he wrote his famous discourse in which he connected Freemasonry with the Crusader Knights, but he also alluded to the rebuilding of the temple when he said, and I'm quoting him, "This union was made after the example set by the Israelites when they erected the second temple, who, whilst they handled the trowel and mortar with one hand, in the other held the sword and buckler," unquote. For many years, people have assumed that Ramsay's discourse inspired the creation of Masonic chivalric degrees. Although this may be true, it's also possible that he learned about the Second Temple tradition in its Masonic context from Scottish masters. Masonic historians have noted that the Scots Master were popular in England from the mid-1740s when they disappeared at about the same time as they appeared in other places, such as France and Germany. As the Scots Master disappeared in England, a new degree emerged there called the Royal Arch, or Holy Royal Arch. What's interesting is that this new degree had many of the same features as the Scots Master degree. They were both concerned with the rebuilding of the temple and the discovery of a certain lost secret. Well, why is this? Well, it makes sense when you consider that in the mid-1740s, the Jacobite rebellion occurred. This person, Charles Edward Stuart, often called Bonnie Prince Charlie, was the pretender to the English throne who spent less than 14 months in Scotland during his lifetime. His family, the Stuarts, were one of England's most enduring dynasties with a claim to unite three kingdoms, Scotland, England, and Ireland. The Jacobites, who took their name from Jacobus, Latin for James, were supporters of the movement to reinstate Charles' grandfather, the Roman Catholic Stuart king, James VII, and his heirs to the throne after his exile to France in 1688. There's a coincidental Masonic connection here. Bonnie Prince Charlie's tutor was Chevalier Ramsay. In the middle of the Scottish Rebellion, no self-respecting English Freemason would want to be called a Scot or a Scottish master, but the same Englishman could be a perfectly acceptable Royal Archmason. All you needed to do was drop anything remotely connected to the title Scottish from your degree and make a couple of revisions, and you'd be good to go. Hence the question, are you a Scots Master or a Royal Archmason? The answer may be, that depends upon when you were asked the question. The person who connects the English high degrees with the French Écossais tradition and brings them to the New World is the famous Stephen Morin. Unfortunately, we don't have a painting of him, and we don't know yet in what year he was made a Mason. But his business as a merchant allowed him to be a great influence in Masonry. We know that by 1744, he was conferring the, quote, mysteries of Scots perfection. Morin was the driving force behind the creation of the Écossais Mother Lodge in Bordeaux and was among the signers of the regulations of the Perfect Scottish Lodge in 1745. While traveling on business, he was twice captured at sea as a prisoner of war by the British, first in 1745 and again in 1762. Upon his second capture, he spent 2 months in London, where he became acquainted with the Grand Master of England, who appointed him an inspector of its jurisdiction for a part of the New World and bestowed upon him certain sublime titles. Morin was more than an enthusiastic Mason who collected degrees. He also revised them, and we believed that he authored several rituals. One of the rituals which Stephen Morin apparently acquired was this one, the Perfect Scottish Elect, or the sacred vault called the Square. A note in the ritual states that he received it in 1744 from the Governor-General, William Matthew of the Leeward Islands, and that Morin later established this degree in France. The ritual includes many important features that were common elements to both the Scottish Rite tradition as well as the Royal Arch. Among the interesting things is that the ritual includes the phrase, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God." The phrase continues to be in many English rituals of the Royal Arch. But the ritual also has a certain word which is divided into 3 parts, which is similar to one used in both the Royal Arch and the Lodge of Perfection, the only difference being whether it is spelled with the letter J or a G. And the substance of the degree is actually related to both the Royal Arch and the Lodge of Perfection. A further confirmation of the relationship between the Scots Master and the Royal Arch appears in a 1746 letter written by a certain brother du Tillet, who tells his correspondents, quote, "By inspection of this letter, you can easily know that I am indeed a Scots Master. In any case, I should be able to prove it to you by the words that are under the vault." This, of course, alludes to a practice known to Royal Arch Masons. It's interesting that the title of the degree, Sacred Vault, could mean the same thing as the Holy Arch. In fact, it is both a Scottish degree as well as a Royal Arch degree. With these facts, we can understand why the Scottish Rite's traditional 13th and 14th degrees, Royal Arch and Perfection, can be viewed as 2 parts of the same degree. Old rituals, such as this one, often have common elements to both. Stephen Morin is most famously known as the founder of the 25-degree Order of the Royal Secret, which was the parent of the Scottish Rite. Although we know he received a patent from France to spread the high degrees in the New World, we also know that he expanded his powers and revised its degrees. For many years, it was wondered which rituals he used. This ritual collection of 29 degrees in France's National Library is known as the Baylo FM 415 manuscript, dated to about 1764. It includes a large collection of Écossais degrees, many of which became part of the Order of the Royal Secret. In fact, there are good reasons to believe that this collection was actually owned by Stephen Morin. Some of the language in the degrees translates word for word with what his deputy, Henry Andrew Franken, translated into English. I realize that this is a lot of history, and I'm quickly coming to an end, but bear with me just a moment longer. Let's summarize a couple of points. The early Scots Masonry first appeared in London in 1733. It referred to a kind of higher masonry considered superior to the craft degrees. It moved quickly to France and Germany and was worked on both sides of the Atlantic by Stephen Morin from about the 1740s through the 1760s. Morin gathered many of these degrees and created the 25-degree Order of the Royal Secret in 1762. When our Scottish Rite was created in 1801 from the Order of the Royal Secret, we inherited all 25 degrees. In our early days, we also had two sets of constitutions. The so-called secret constitutions, allegedly dated August 1761, and the constitutions of 1786, which today govern the Scottish Rite. The secret constitutions explained that the 33-degree system was comprised of three rites: ancient, modern, and Scottish. The ancients and moderns were, of course, the names of the two rival English Grand Lodges, and the Scottish was that system of superior degrees which started in 1733, and by meandering roads ended with our own Scottish Rite. This beautiful drawing of the symbolic camp of what appears at the end of the Baillot manuscript. The Royal Secret degrees seem to have been written by our friend Stephen Morin to gather the Scottish degrees into one place, which were symbolized by this drawing of the encampment. It was the final degree to his system and is today the penultimate degree of the Scottish Rite, leaving only the 33rd degree, which was originally limited to 9 presiding officers in a Supreme Council. As Scottish Rite Masons, we can justly and truthfully lay claim to a legacy which reaches near to the beginning of our fraternity. Our degrees continue to inspire us today, just as they inspired our ancient brethren. They invite us to better ourselves and improve the world at large. In a broken world, they ask us to clear the rubbish of the old temple and rebuild, with a sword in one hand and the trowel in the other. That is our heritage and our task as Scottish Rite Masons. Thank you, brethren.